I was just joking with Danny and Kathy Escamilla here that this is about the best justification that anyone can give us for the new building. To which we will be moving very, very soon. Thank you so much for coming to spend the next hour and few minutes with us. We are very, very happy to kick off this year's BUENO Center Lunchtime Colloquium series with a dear, dear friend who came all the way from California to be with us and brought my Pinky Promise BFF, who is his toddler daughter, Amelia. I'm going to pass around a sign-in sheet, actually, so if you could make sure that you grab one of them and get your name on it as this goes around, I would really appreciate it. So, Dr. Danny Martinez is coming to us from University of California, Davis. He's an associate professor of language, literacy, and culture. As I said, he's a dear friend to many of us. We cross paths with him and have been crossing paths with him here and everywhere because of the shared interest that many of our faculty and students have with the work that he does. So we're very, very glad that you're here. We're thrilled. He examines the language and literacy practices of Black and Latinx youth in secondary English language arts classrooms. And his research particularly explores the linguistic agility of Black and Latinx youth, in addition to the stigmatized nature of these practices within the English language arts classrooms, which often normalize academic varieties of English as a precursor for participation and learning. That's all I'm going to say, because you're going to get to then hear for the rest of the time about a piece of his work. Again, I welcome you, and we'll have time at the end for interaction and questions. So thank you, Danny.
Thank you, and thank you all. Thank you, Millie. Thank you, Millie, for inviting me here, the BUENO Center for sponsoring the event, and also just everyone for being here today. I know this is week one. We're spoiled on the quarter system. I still have about a month left before we begin. But really, I just want to appreciate the time taken to be here to share and think with me as I present some work that is pretty new, given that we collected it and we're analyzing now with our research team. So I'm gonna also. Yeah, so I'll just tell you now. I'm gonna get you all talking as well in a bit. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, because who I am really makes sense to the work that I engage in, the scholarship that I engage in. I lost my. There it is. So I'm coming to you as that nerdy brown Chicano high school student in LA who wasn't cool enough for the cool kids. Wasn't nerdy enough to be in those AP honors classes and often tracked kind of in the middle, like many of our students. Many times in California, Avid's pretty big, so I would have been that group that would have been captured by Avid if those programs would have existed back then. The kid who was told not to apply to college, the kid, we have, as a former teacher and college counselor, I remember hearing these stories, and I'm coming to you with these experiences because they were important to me. They are important to me as I continue to work alongside Black, Latinx youth, other non-dominant youth, and their teachers, and continue to hear the stories of how these voices, these experiences of Black and Latinx youth are continually marginalized in our classrooms and continually indexed for some people, those gates that need to stop access into certain spaces. So I'm coming to you as one of those folks. Engaged in this research. The title of today's talk is Leveraging and Sustaining Black and Latinx Youth Cultural and Linguistic Repertoires for Teacher Learning. This work is coming from, it's part two of the work of my larger research agenda, which is to really think about, to have teachers think, listen, hear, and know about the cultural and linguistic practices of Black and Latinx youth, specifically those that they share with each other. And I'll talk about why this is important in a bit. Much of my work is conducted in English language arts classrooms. I'm interested in taking all the literature that exists that talks about the rich practices of Black children and youth, the rich practices of Latinx children and youth, beginning from the ethnography of communication tradition in the 60s and moving forward as we have developed a better understanding of the rules and the grammar that is part of these linguistic systems and how they're social culturally, these languages social cultural context is important to these languages. So when I started my initial work, I was really interested, and I ended up going back to the community that, the school that I taught at. This is a school I call Willow High School. I'm going to talk about this briefly because we'll then talk about the next project. Well, Willow High School is a school that was important to me because it was a school that I was supposed to go to. I grew up across the tracks in a community I work Home Gardens. This was a community that was predominantly Mexican at the time I was growing up, now LatinX, where we have many Central American and Mexican communities together. It was a community that pushed my mother out of school when she was a senior in high school, when she went there in the 60s, never encouraging her to come back. It was a school where my father attended for night school to learn English and to conduct and to take citizenship classes. So this is the context that I came back to work in. We have this community of Black and Latinx students, 80% Latinx at this time, 20% Black. A complete shift from the 80-20, where it was 80 Black, 20% Latinx. It was a decade prior to my arrival there. But these shifts were happening. And what I saw, based on my teaching there, was that Black and Latinx youth were using language. They were engaging, Ben Rapton might call it language crossing. Django Paris might call it language sharing. But what I saw was a lot more, I saw evidence of peer language socialization. These were Black and Latino youth who were walking to school with each other, who were living next to each other, who had been sitting next to each other in classrooms since they were elementary school kids. And across this time and space, there were other recent immigrant children who were entering their spaces, entering their communities, their neighborhoods, and schools. To the point when I was an ESL teacher at this school, we had a teacher, a veteran teacher, who came up to me when I was doing my research, and she was my department chair when I was an ESL teacher. She wanted to know what my research was about, and what she wanted me to do is to have her ESL students stop saying the word ax instead of ask. So this is the kind of environment we're thinking about, where Black and Latinx youth are socializing one another, but their teachers, and many teachers that I documented, did not know what to do or saw what those language practices were as indicative of not wanting to participate in learning, or they're evidence of them not being ready to enter the spaces using academic or standard varieties of English. So that's where my initial work took place. And what I want to share with you next is I want to get you all to talk and think about what this means in the classroom. And when I think about the language practices of Black and Latinx students, I do focus on Black language practices spoken by Latinx youth, Spanish approximations by Black youth, but I think what's more important is what these youth do with one another in classroom spaces. And what happens when they're attempting to make meaning in classroom spaces. So what I'm going to share with you is what I would do with some of the teachers that I've been working with. I'm going to share with you a piece of data that comes from a 10th grade English language arts classroom in Los Angeles. The students in this classroom have just talked about Julius Caesar, the scene where Brutus and his homies attack Caesar, and you all know that part, and they take him out, as the students would say. And I want you to listen to what's happening in the classroom as the teacher's asking students a known answer question, asking students to think about the interaction and to think about what they would do if they were Caesar. Okay, so I'm gonna share with you this interaction. I'm gonna stop at line 4 and it continues on the next page, but I'm gonna have a stop at the end of line 9 here and ask you all to talk to one another and think about, if you were the teacher in this classroom, how would you respond? How would you respond to anything that you're noticing in this interaction?
Caesar trusted Brutus. And in fact, when he stabbed by all these men, right? He's jumped, right? Did he stab by all these men? Girl.
Shame.
All right.
Okay. So take a minute. Turn to your partner or folks around you. You are the teacher in this interaction. You are Miss Luce. How would you respond to hearing what Jordy just said in the classroom?
Exactly.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt. If I can have your attention now. Sorry to interrupt. I wish I could audio record all of these conversations. Can anyone share how you might respond if you were Miss Luce in this interaction? Jamie, it looks like you're ready. I just see it. I see it. Sorry to pick on you.
I should turn it over to Arturo, because Arturo was really thinking about like how the teacher, like he said, the micro interaction. So not just what was said, but how it was said.
Right. So I think that what we were thinking about is that we wanted to make shanked an object of inquiry. So we were thinking about what we would actually say. Would it be shanked, a question mark, or shanked? to elevate, shanked. So we're trying to think about like what we would say.
Any other comments? Yeah.
So we discussed that we would validate the student even though it's a colloquialism, and like explain it in other ways too. So say, yeah, he was shanked, like, or stabbed, and then that validates the student and keeps them learning instead of saying you have this like rigorous standard of academic excellence and shanked is not a word you should be using. By doing that, you may take the student away from them wanting to participate in class.
One adding to that, just modeling, so like what code switching is and was and what it was like to grow up, learning how to code switch and what that did to like advance and what that helps you do and the opportunities it brings to you when you know how to code switch effectively.
Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
And we were talking about how shanking is actually maybe a more accurate word to describe it. Stabbing is pretty broad in general.
Yeah.
So it's sort of opening up to be like, what makes you say that in this given situation, he was shanked and not just stabbed?
Thank you.
I would want to know, I would want to read the class and see how many people understood what shanked was. And if they all understood it, I might just keep going.
Yes.
And because I wouldn't want to interrupt the conversation.
Thank you, Adi. And these are, I love asking teachers what they would do, pre-service teachers and service teachers, because we get this range of responses. Some will automatically go like, this needs to be put on the word wall, and all the different ways what shank means. A teacher that I write about in a piece that talks about how he believes, as someone said, there's more nuance to the words shanked versus stabbed. So these are all responses. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how Ms. Luce responds to this in the next interaction.
These are trusted,
It's going to start from the beginning.
rooted. And in fact, when he's stabbed by all these men, right? He's jumped, right? Did he stab by all these men? Girl.
Shame.
All right. So when he's stabbed by all these men, isn't it a fact that he only reacts to his best friend, the last guy who stabbed him? The rest, he's more in shock and just like trying to control his pain. But when his best friend stabs him, what does he say to him?
I'm from the project.
He does not say I'm from the project, Henry. Is there trusted?
Sorry. Okay, so when we continue on, what teachers have always noticed is that there was no real attention to the word shanked in the interaction. And in fact, we talk about how there's an embedded repair in the revoicing of the statement. Ms. Luce says, all right, so when he's stabbed by all these men, she's revoicing his statement, but also there's a repair of his use of the shank, not giving it attention, not acknowledging that that was a contribution, but somewhat of a correction for more appropriate or school-like language. But then we go on in the interaction. I forgot to mention this, that Willow High School is surrounded by 3 housing projects. In this community, there's only one group of students who are living in the western part of the community who will not cross a housing project when they're coming to school. So everyone has to either walk through one, around it. And there's always talk of what's happening in the projects. So when Miguel here, Henry here, when she's stating, but when his best friend stabbed him, what does he say to him? And Henry responds, I'm from the projects. Again, we see Miss Luce just kind of dismissing this idea that is really informing some meaning making for the students in the classroom. There's laughter, there's some alignment in the laughter, but it's also funny. But Henry's serious, like his face is like, that's what he would tell Brutus. And we see Miss Luce's response, he does not say I'm from the projects, Henry. For the sake of time, I didn't do what I typically do, and I would stop right here and ask teachers to respond, like how would you respond? And again, we have frustrated teachers when they hear how Miss Luce did respond and didn't really allow, the conversation ended there. There was no time for Henry to really unpack what he said. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm thinking about the language and literacy practices that inform the meaning making of Black and Latinx youth in their classrooms. Shanked may not be seen as an appropriate term. Talking about the projects in connection to Julius Caesar perhaps wasn't appropriate for the teacher in this classroom, who was Latina, fifth-year teacher at the time of this research. But what I saw across the classrooms, 3 classrooms that I observed at Willow High School, is that this kind of interaction consistently happened. Where it could be at the word level, where a student uses a word that isn't seen as appropriate, or it could be at the idea level, where students were bringing in cultural practices and attempting to make meaning, where third spaces, we think about Chris's work, weren't allowed to emerge. Like they were there, but they weren't cultivated. So I'm going to move on now and think about what I want to talk about today in the new work, and talk about how the work is informed by the need for my continued thinking around leveraging and what it means in language and literacy research. What does it mean to leverage and level the communicative repertoires of Black and Latinx youth in literacy learning contexts? And in my new work, we'll see that the community is also Black, Latinx, and Filipino, 30-30-30. And so in work I've done with Citlali Morales at UIC and Ursula Aldana at University of San Francisco, we're thinking about how the field has taken up leveraging, and how for many people leveraging, this idea of using one thing to get to another thing, typically follows the idea that you're going to use the home and community languages, because we've been saying this as language and literacy scholars, we're going to build on it to access the standard or academic variety, okay? But we're not doing the work of leveling, which Margarita Zesselberger talks about, where we're raising the prestige of those home and community languages while we're asking students to access the dominant language, or what people call mainstream American English, standard English, academic English, whatever we want, however we're thinking about them in the literacy learning context. And what we're thinking about in this piece is asking the field to think about how we can leverage in ways that level, but also transform how students begin to think about their language practices in the classroom. How they can see the languages of their homes, the languages of their communities. I think of Dr. Ernest Morale when I think about the language that his grandmothers taught to us in, the scoldings they gave us, the love they showed us. All of that, for many Black and Latinx youth, aren't being recognized, valued, or when they bring it into the classroom, we just see how encapsulated learning is for them in these spaces. So I really, in conjunction with Zisselberger's work on leveling, I want us to think in this work about how we raise those prestige levels of these languages, while also recognizing, I'm not very, this is my PowerPoint graphic design, sorry. But I would imagine also like an arrow coming down on this leveling because of language ideologies that often mediate, when we try to raise the prestige levels, there's often those ideologies that really come in and try to stop folks, children, from really accepting their language practices as valuable. I get it all the time in teacher meetings and seminars, and in reviews as well. In this work and thinking about leveraging the language and literacy practices, I want to think about reimagining teacher learning in the ELA context so that we can, as it relates to leveraging these language practices in the classroom. So how do we get teachers to engage in the practices of, Kathy shows us sort of listening, right? How do we get teachers to listen? How do we get, Gutierrez and colleagues, including Arturo and Jose, have talked to us about seeing anew, right? How do we see what the ingenuity of youth in their mundane practices, and I'm thinking about hearing as well, with the work of Rosa and Flores and Rosa, how do we do that for teachers and get in spaces that we can design to have them think about this a bit more? So I think about, again, just an overview, I'm thinking about the communicative repertoires of Black and Latinx youth. From the scholar, what I showed you all in the beginning, that example, that for me has become part of what, like Carol Lee's youth cultural data sets. For me, they're youth data sets for teacher focus groups that I've done. Okay, these become generative pieces that I can share with teachers later on, and I've done it with the teachers that I'll share with you in a bit. And then what I'm going to talk about today is work coming out of the Leveraging Language Working Group that started at Northern California High School, the school that I've currently started work with. I want to quickly, though, acknowledge, when I'm thinking about teacher learning and reimagining what it looks like for this space, that I'm also informed by folks outside of education, like Kuhn and Pulido, who are really trying to address these Black and brown tensions and think about them in robust ways and nuanced ways. Kuhn and Pulido really pushed back against the notion. There's a scholar by Vaca, a legal scholar, who argues that there's this presumed alliance between Black and Latinx youth. Okay, and he's critiquing this idea that we got to acknowledge that it's not, there is no alliance. Kuhn and Pulido are arguing, like, if we can't presume that there is not alliance at the same time, and we have to really think about how, yes, there are some issues in Black and Latinx communities. Really, if we look at them, the reasons why they're in tension are many times because of lack of resources, structural racism. We can go on there, but they're really saying we can't just say it's presumed, so let's ignore it. Let's attend to it. Teresa Gay Ivy really helped me really think of, Gay Teresa Johnson really helps me think about how in activism and through music and the arts, Black and Latinx communities have been in solidarity movements for time, and we just don't recognize them often. And again, Laura Pulido and Black, Brown, Yellow, and Left really gets us to think about coalition building and what it might look like for us to reimagine spaces of coalition between Black, Brown, and other groups in our communities. And I'm taking that with me and thinking about what that means for Black, Brown solidarity in language arts classrooms, given the fact that they already have some commonalities in terms of their language and literacy practices. And I also take with me the work of Paris and Alim in culturally sustaining pedagogies that remind us that when we're sustaining the language and literacy practices, we're not just going back to those traditionals. Those traditional practices are important, but we have to make sense of the ingenuity, what they call we must be open to sustaining them in both the traditional and evolving ways that are lived and used by young people, okay? Young people they're engaging in some new practices that are different from the past. So we have to attend to these differences as well. So when thinking about designing for expansive teacher learning, I'm informed by the notion, Engelstrom's notion of breaking through the encapsulation of schooling. Okay, he argues that we must, many times schooling encapsulates students in these spaces, especially when students have no say in what happens in the curriculum or they don't see their lives involved in the learning. We need to design research where equity is at the forefront, as argued by Gutierrez and Giroux. Looking for we have folks who are arguing for flexible research where all stakeholders are present and have a say, including youth, teachers, administrators, research community members. This is work by Bakil, DeRoyston, Nasir, and Kirshner. And then designing research that is restorative for Black and Latinx youth. Currently, I'm working with Maisha Nguyen and her Transformative Justice and Education project, and really starting to think about the damage, thinking about what happens in these classrooms historically and how it is damaging. There was some violence enacted on, Black and Latinx youth many times for their language and literacy practices and cultural practices. So what does it mean to design restorative literacy education for Black and Latinx youth? So the school that I did research at was along we're calling it the Capitol Corridor in Northern California. I'll show you a bit more about the school in a bit, but during the 2016 through 2018 academic years, we did 2 years. The first year was purely ethnographic observations in 2 classrooms. Throughout the time, we did focus groups using the data sets that I showed you previously. We conducted some semi-structured interviews with Mr. Michaelson and Mr. Alcordo, who were, Mr. Michaelson is a white teacher who was in his first year at this time. Mr. Alcordo is a Filipino teacher who was in his 5th year at this time. The following year is when we did the work that we conducted the work that you'll see here. We continued our ethnographic observations, but we started video recording in Mr. Michelson's 11th grade ELA class. Part of this work was allowing Mr. Michelson to see and choose some clips from his own classroom teaching. So following the work of video clubs by Marjorie Sheeran. He was in conversation with myself and Javier Rojo, my graduate student who was involved in the project, and he selected the clip we'll see in a bit as the first clip that he wanted to share with some of his colleagues, teacher colleagues, administrators, and we had one student and ourselves involved in the conversation or the video club that we refer to as a Leveraging Language Working Group. Again, we continued observations and we're keeping track of shifts over time that were happening in the space, and we continued. We started these Leveraging Language Working Groups at the end of the second year, with the idea that we would continue on for a 3rd year, and I'll just say this now, Mr. Michelson left to Southern California, so this project ended when he and his leadership team left the school, which is it's happening in both my projects, so I'm hoping the next project has a pretty consistent team, but everyone who was my contact in the school left, so this is where the project here ended, but I'm sharing this so that I can think about the next project that will be in the Sacramento area, where we can start off knowing that these video clubs or the Leveraging Language Working Groups will continue. Just a bit about the space. Northern California High School is located in this Capitol corridor. There's about 1,600 students, and you can see the breakdown. This is considered one of the most diverse schools in the state, communities in the state of California, and has been written about in the New York Times, the LA Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle, as people tend to think about this space because it's so diverse. And you see this in the school demographics, where it's almost 30, but it's the third, 30% African American, 27 Latinx, 25% Filipino, and then we have a breakdown of white, Asian, Pacific Islander, indigenous, and mixed race students at the space. Again, the teachers, I'll just say something about Mr. Michaelson because he's the teacher who we're going to be hearing from in the bit. He, day one, when we started working with him, introduced himself to us, and we were there day one with his students, and he introduces himself as Mr. Michaelson. I'm a gay white male, and I understand that you have to get to know me as a white man teaching mostly students of color. He would talk to his students about this. He made it very clear to us that he wanted to remind students that he was a gay man every day. So he, in his interviews, talked about performing certain performances that he did that were just part of his identity, according to him, that he just wanted to normalize what it meant to be a gay man for his students in his classroom. So after video recording in his classroom, myself and my graduate student, in conjunction with Mr. Michaelson, we watched a few video clips, as I mentioned, and he chose one where he's taking up or using a word that was that he heard a student using, and he brought this piece that you'll see in a bit, so that he can share it with Manuel, who was one of his own students, a Latino student in 11th grade. Mr. Michaelson is here. He's the focus teacher. Ms. G is a Filipina teacher in English Language Arts. Ms. C is the vice principal of this school and the head of his academy. And Ms. L is the principal. Sorry, Ms. K is the principal of the school. And he identified these folks as folks he wanted in the interaction. A methodological flaw that I shriek every time I see it. Javier's here, my graduate student, and I'm on the other end. We completely kept ourselves. We were out of view of the camera. In the next focus group we used a swivel so we were all captured, because we are also part of this team. To begin the Leveraging Language Working Group, we had them create norms, and many of the norms were created for the student. As you can see here, the first one that the principal offered was, students will not hurt anyone's feelings with their comments and should say what they feel. I don't think this truly mitigated how the student was feeling in their interaction, but this is what their norm was. the teachers asked that direct and critical honesty should be used when discussing the teaching being viewed. But actually that was from Mr. Michaelson. He wanted anyone to tell him if they saw something that was not appropriate or any kind of critical feedback. The conversation and research should benefit growth in all participants. They wanted all of them to benefit from this. When engaging in the conversation, always reference the film. We did this to just get everyone on track. We're referencing the film at all times. And the spirit of Courtney Kasdan, I asked if he wanted to Mr. Michaelson wanted to be referred to as the teacher or by his name, and he asked that everything be referred to him by his name. So the clip that Mr. Michaelson chose, titled "You May Slap." I'm going to show we shared this with the focus group, the Leveraging Language Working Group, and I'll share this with you today. And what he found really important is what he did towards the end of this interaction. And we were able, and I'll share a bit more about this when we listen to it, but the word to listen to is the word slap. This is within the classroom, Mr. Michaelson is just setting up the workings, what's going to happen with the students, what they're going to be responsible for as they begin working.
Okay, so as I said at the beginning of class, let's remember that we're near a break and that it's time to push it, right? Because a lot of you still have to put your college applications in here, but look at how many I already have. I already have about 5 of them from people who completed them. This is doable. A lot of people have gotten it done. So if you're already done, you have work to do in terms of putting together your research proposal. You should open up a Google Doc. You should start creating a research proposal that looks just like the one that Stephanie Kahina did last year, that you have an example of. If you are not done with your college application, what should you be doing with the rest of this time?
Finishing games.
Yeah. So you can talk to ask questions. You may also slap. Okay.
So you can also slap. Does anyone know what slap means in this context?
In the Bay, that means to play music.
Yeah. Play music. I went down the Urban Dictionary. But and there's like anything from like listening to good music from the Bay, very specifically to the Bay, right? So what we learned later on, and this is why Mr. Michaelson chose this clip, there was attention to this interaction when Mr. Michaelson heard one of his students use the word slap and asked him, what does that mean? My research assistant Javier during field notes witnessed interaction where the student said it, and also there was an interaction around the word slap. So this was the 3rd time that we had observed or we knew about slap coming up in the classroom. So when we asked them to start thinking about just the clip in general, we started off with like very technical things. Like I like the way Mr. Michaelson talks to the students. It's very calming. They were talking about his room and what he was doing. And it wasn't until Miss L came in, and we'll hear her talking about this word slap.
I like how Kyle uses the word you can slap because it's
Sorry
kind
about
of
the text.
like putting a positive connotation to work, because usually when it's like, oh, it's time to work, it's like, oh, you know, I have to get things done, or I don't want to work. But it can be something that not necessarily enjoy in a way, but it's just that it doesn't need to be an unpleasant experience for you to work.
Javier, can I ask you to share how this word emerged as important in our research?
Yeah, so when I first heard the term, because I heard it from one of the students and then you picked it up, and I didn't know what the word meant. So right after you assigned their task and they were working individually, I believe I asked you, what does that term mean? And then you told me that it's if I remember correctly, a term that is used in the Bay Area.
It was here by my student.
Yeah.
Can you add to that?
Yeah, it's a term that we use in the Bay Area to more like indicate a good time to listen to music, to relax, but it can also be a term that can be used for, okay, we maybe have like time to listen to music, but we can also do something productive, or also do something that's like, more positive.
All right. So in this interaction, we notice how Ms. G is the first who brings, she likes how Kyle uses the word slap. She makes a comment saying that he's making work more pleasant. You know, students can engage in this, the notion of slapping, listening to music. And then from lines 10 to 21, we hear Javier, who's a graduate student assistant, who talks about those moments that I explained that he heard slap being used. And then all of us, we're a bit worried about having students in this group because we weren't sure if they would feel comfortable in this space. We were just worried about how they might feel. We didn't want to tokenize them. You know, we wanted them to feel part of the group. Mr. Michaelson felt like he made several invitations and he recommended Miguel only because he felt like he would be okay responding in an interaction like this. And this is one of the moments where we felt like we need student voices in this interaction. We need to hear from students when we're thinking about what teachers are doing. And we also notice how he's engaging in some redefining of this term as well, where he's telling them, yeah, it's a term we use in the Bay Area to indicate a good time to listen to music. But then he's really thinking about how this typically unsanctioned event of engaging in slap time is entering this encapsulated space like a classroom, right? So you're bringing in this practice into the classroom, and here's where he engages in this shifting redefining of the word. But we can also do something productive, okay? So he's taking the fact that they're allowed to do it while working. You can do something productive and something that's like, you know, to do something that is more positive. And in talking to some students later, slap time was not seen as positive in the classroom spaces, right? But really, it's just, they're just hanging out listening to music. That's what slap time was for them. But the idea of them saying slap for some teachers just didn't go well. I wanted to hear from...
Kyle uses the word...
I wanted to hear from Mr. Michaelson himself, and he's the next person who chimes in. I'm sorry for the text that's so small in this interaction. So this is from Mr. Michaelson, who's the next to chime in after Miguel did.
Yeah, I was like, I think it's about like, so Mazzani used it the first time. Can we slap? And I said, what? And you know, like it's like I think it's just being authentic. I think it's just like being a human in a human space, and it's really like I like moments when I don't understand what a student's saying and they have authority over the language in the moment, because that's why language is interesting to me. Is like it's living, it's exciting. People's choices are interesting in the way that they use language, and so I think that recognizes that in that moment. But it's not like, oh, slap, you know, like it doesn't. It's not like, oh, like hip cool thing I get to say now. It's like, it's like, okay, like that makes sense. That's a word that makes sense in this moment to me too, and I can use it in my way of speaking, but like use it because I get the feeling of it. It's like the feeling, the texture of the word makes sense to me now. It's like exactly what Miguel is saying. Like this is something that can be about a kickback, but it can also be about like, oh, it's like a way of taking off the edge on working, right? And so like, because I feel like the texture of the word, it feels authentic. It's not being used in like a hackneyed way. Because I'm the type of person who would say hackneyed. But also
Okay, so we see here Mr. Michaelson trying to make sense of, just to remind you again, he chose this clip and he really wanted to unpack, he was feeling some kind of way about using this language that would like belong to students. And we see like even Javier talks about you picked it up. Like this is like, you're taking something from youth. But he's trying to, what I enjoy about Mr. Michaelson is how he reflected on how there was shifting expertise in this context. He's recognizing that he doesn't have the expertise all the time in his classroom. And this is pretty evident in the ethnographic observations the prior year and throughout this year, where Mr. Michaelson did really have expansive understandings of what counted as language. Many things counted, not just from what students were saying, but he also tried to shift it from the types of text students were reading, where he'd bring in spoken word as the text of a classroom. In another paper I'm working on, I'm looking at how This Is America became a central text in this classroom as recommended by a student. So he's not making it even supplementary, it becomes central. And more canonical text becomes a supplemental in some instances. he's also saying here how he was grappling with this, like trying to make sense. Am I just saying it because he doesn't want to say it because it sounds cool or anything? Like he's really conscious of that. He's pretty young. He's the second-year teacher this time, few years apart from the students in his classroom. But he also he made it very clear in an interview when we talked about this piece. Again, talking about his identity as a gay white male. He's like, I'm constantly worried about appropriation. As a gay white male, I understand that we've appropriated the language of black women. He's like, so I'm thinking about this all the time. So this tension I see as a source of something good for our teachers to deal with as they're thinking about their identities and how it informs what they do in classrooms. I'm going to walk us through this. I won't play this one, but I want to share what's happening here, because what happens in the group. We have a teacher who's responded. We have Mr. Michaelson. We have the student. Javier responds to in some interactions. The principal, the administrators in this group, even though this space was, we agreed that it was going to be a space where we're going to talk about what was happening in the group, there was this evaluative nature of comments that came from the administrators. Mm-hmm. So Ms. K was talking about how, I have to play this. I'm looking at Millie on the clock.
But I say I think that's what it is. That's that dip and back up again. Because then you'll pull that word out. And the kids will go, what's that word? So it's almost like you guys share. And in that environment of sharing, everybody gets better. And I think everybody understands that they're on that journey. So I think that's the other piece that maybe is a long-term feel for that space, even though probably not planned. But because you can dip, but you also give something that they're like, what's that word? He said, what? Yeah, but you would then do the same thing. What? You know what I mean? But I say, I think
Ms. K in this interaction, she uses this word dip and come back again a lot, not just in this space. It's a phrase she keeps on using throughout our conversation. And she says, because of the relationship that Michaelson has with the kids, you dip down to use their language and then you come back up to them.
Yeah.
Okay. So even in this interaction, we see, let's use student language, but let's also remember we're going to come back up. Mm-hmm. And in later interviews with Mr. Michaelson, he reflected on this piece, arguing how he was very frustrated at that point. And he's like, I understood that the context we were in wasn't the place to go after Miss K. But he's like, but I'm not surprised as well because of and what we're thinking about. Like we know what mediates their own understanding of what should happen in the classroom. But what I want to end by saying is that these kinds of interactions, although we did two with this group, I'm continuing to think about these interactions because it brings people together who aren't typically together in teacher learning spaces. Even thinking about how we can bring students in a bit more appropriate, to have more students. More students were invited, but one showed up to each one of the sessions. Giving them some I don't even want to say training, but some socialization into how do we view video, how do we react? How do we get administrators to be in these conversations without having those evaluative lens at all times, and just more supportive in thinking about what was happening and what Mr. Michaelson wanted to know from this interaction. I'll end just by saying, like, why does this matter? And one of the things I want to bring attention to is, like, I'm really interested in youth everyday language. It may not be connected to what's happening in the lesson. I'm just interested in what they're saying to each other, what they say to the teacher, even if it's not related to what's happening. When kids are talking about the party that's happening in the weekend, there's some awesome interactions that are happening. They're talking about why one party was better than the other, they're comparing, they're contrasting, they're giving some evidence. That's really interesting to me, and I think it's interesting because youth language is consequential for their learning in classrooms, and teachers need to understand that they have to listen, they have to understand the value in those linguistic practices, their communicative repertoires, and also be able to understand that those practices can be leveled in their classroom for learning. Again, we need to notice youth everyday language. As I mentioned earlier, we need to learn to see anew. We need to learn how to hear differently. We have to learn how to listen. Thank you, Kath. And some of the work that Ramon Martinez and I are working on is really thinking about the need for drawing on some of the work that Kathy Schultz has offered, the need for listening before expanding. We know there's a lot of folks that are talking about the need for teachers to expand their linguistic repertoires or the communicative repertoires, but we have to engage in that listening. It's really important to do the listening to know what youth are doing in our classrooms and outside. And then again, it matters because when teachers start to recognize the harm that has been done in ways that they may not even be clear about. They may not know that some of the repair work that they're doing harms kids every day, year after year in certain classrooms. I interviewed students who talked about like, yeah, people correct me all the time when I say the teacher be like, correcting black language to standard American English. There's an understanding of this, and we need to think about how youth everyday language has mediated harm for them in literacy learning context. So we need to work towards repairing the harm, shifting what repair means in this work, and work towards a restorative education in our classroom. So thank you all for having me.
Before we take questions, I just want to make sure that we have a beyond full house and that we document how many awesome people showed up today. So there's 2 sheets that are going around. Just make sure that it keeps going so everybody can sign in. But let's use up the rest of the time that we have. I'll let you direct that.
Yes.
When discussing this topic with teachers, is there ever acknowledgement that that language is not just specific to youth? Like, for instance, I see it as it's like urban colloquialisms. It's like things that I know adults to say, as well as like I've worked in the Bay for the last like 5 years. And a lot of those things are said in the community, and that's where the youth pick it up and they bring it forward to school. But in specifically naming it as youth language, it's like kind of taking away the acknowledgement that adults use it too, so it's just a culture.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think especially in this context where I was more actively in conversation with the students, with the teacher, excuse me. Mr. Alcordo, who wasn't in the scene, Miss G, Filipino teacher, were born and raised in the community where this work was, and they talked about that. Like, she talks about how slap was something she grew up using in the neighborhood, but also other terms and other language practices that they got from adults in their community. So yeah, it is, when I talk about youth language, I'm thinking specifically because of the youth in our classrooms, but definitely recognizing the fact that we're socialized to and through language by adults and more quote-unquote expert others in our community. But they're definitely, yeah, I'll just leave it at that, yes. Yes?
I'm curious why, in that the one teacher's language saying, sorry, my throat's dip and come back up, that sort of deficit, why wasn't that a space to kind of confront that? I guess I'm wondering about that.
And according to Mr. Michaelson, he was, when we interviewed him, this came up specifically, and he was just, this was our first interaction like this, and he used the words, I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to go there yet. Simply because he was just trying to read the temperature of the space. I think even Javier and I as researchers, we didn't want to go there yet because this was a new thing for all of them in this interaction. So definitely something that's part of these design spaces where there's some times where we don't go in, right? We don't do those things for making sure that these can continue afterwards. But I do believe that Ms. K, the principal, was open to hearing that perhaps we don't need to dip, perhaps we're not dipping, perhaps we're just going where we're already up, right? The students are making meaning, they're contributing something that to Mr. Michaelson, who became a learner in that space, and based on some of the data from across the time, this is happening when they're engaging in some literary analysis as well, where they're using this language to make sense of what's happening. Thank you. Yes.
This is so great. Thank you so much. So many of us work with teachers who are at different stages of becoming culturally sustaining teachers. And so I'm wondering if you have any suggestions. We have some, but I think it's always helpful to hear more about how to get a teacher or encourage a teacher to think about things critically. A lot of times I hear a response like, but there is a language of power, and I have to teach these kids that so they're successful. And that's what I often hear, and I have some strategies I know, but I'd love to hear your ideas of response to that gets teachers thinking critically.
and this, I'm going to talk about what I do with my pre-service teachers, and I've done with in-service teachers as well, is making them write their own language or literacy autobiography. And for many monolingual, specifically monolingual white pre-service teachers, when they dig back and start thinking about language in their families, they all have many have this experience of language loss, where they have a nana who spoke Italian, or the language is left in one person in their family, and once that person passes, they're realizing like it's gone. Some students, indigenous students, will talk about like their language was wiped out. I have many LatinX students who talk about their parents, and this was my experience, who did not want them to learn Spanish because of what happened to them in schools when they learned those languages. So starting with them really helped, and there's some work with Steve at the NASA's that we have out there where we're talking about the importance of starting where they're at. You know, Richard Miller talks about starting where they're at and then moving out of there where you're at. And that for me helps them understand their experience so that it can be connected to a shared experience with their students who are in it right at the moment. We have students who understand for the first time how privileged they were just to grow up with books all around them and a family who was reading all the time. And students who talk about not reading much, but they knew how to pay the bills for their immigrant families. They knew how they were engaging in some, what Marjorie Oriana talks about, language brokering experiences. So they have different literacy experiences, but they're starting to, they begin to recognize that some are privileged more than others. So that's where I try to start with. I start with them. When I've done pre-service, I did a PD with this entire group, and the administration wanted me to give them something that they can use tomorrow. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do strategy. But what we did they wanted to talk about student voice, and I took student voice to mean like student language, and really again had them start with like what are some of the ways you speak across different settings. Just getting them to think about how we don't speak the same way everywhere we're at, right? So just a few examples. That's a few things that I've done with some teachers. The kids are here. Yes.
So, you just got me thinking about an experience, and so to put it in context, when I worked in Oakland, my first day there, I was standing next to the principal, and the student said something along the lines of like, my cousin just got caught hitting the lick, stressing me out, and trying to match after school to another student. I knew exactly what that meant. Yeah. I'm like, wow, like, you can't, and I just told her, hey, you can't talk like that at school, I understand you're stressed out, but talk about that somewhere else. The principal was like, what did she just say? Is that my responsibility, because I sit in that like delicate balance of understanding, to explain it to the next adult, or keep the trust intact that the student can handle that moment and like kind of move along and let it go?
You're that culture broker, language broker type of phase. I would actually think about why can't we use that language in schools, right? How can that, what you just said, what the student just said, it was so complicated that the principal didn't understand. If that student were speaking French or another European language, that would be like, that's so cool. That's great that we think about the Queens, there's all this talk about the prince's child who can speak 3 languages now. And when we have, I look at my daughter here and she's speaking 2, and that's not seen as a big deal in many times in schools. But I think that's based on your relationship with the student and the principal. Like sometimes we may want to share some of those things if it's gonna, for me, if the student is in any kind of danger, like I think I would want to mediate that with some kind of passing on some information. But I think that's the tricky part. If you're a researcher, I find myself in that situation. Like, what do you do when you're understanding something that youth are saying that you're not sure if you should pass on or not? Quick example, I have in Miss Luz's classroom, it's another period, they're talking about the same scene, and Miss Luz asks, was Brutus a hero or a murderer? And then we have a student next door, it's a black female youth, I'm sitting right next to her, she turns to her peer and says, he a motherfucking murderer, because the teacher hears it, and I'm like, yeah, he is, And every time I share that clip, everyone was like, yeah, he was a murderer, using her words. But I didn't I've struggled with sharing that data because it's a black female youth saying those things, and I don't want that to stand in place for, this is how they talk all the time. You see, we need to teach them better. But for me, I am also, fortunately, I'm able to see how she did some shifting. The teacher calls on her, and she completely style shifts into, he's a murderer because he traded him with his best friends. You know? So we see that, and I think those are examples of what we need to show teachers. Like students, Black, Latinx, I'm part of that group of folks again. Many of us probably were. We're able to do that style and code shifting in the different contexts with different speakers. And we have to give youth credit for this work that they're doing. I'm sorry, I went there from your question about like what do we do, but I think we're gonna feel it when we're in those spaces, and I always consult with others before I made that move. And if that student was in danger, I would say something. Yeah. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much. Stage, yes. This is my BFF, Pinky Promise. And thank you for gifting us with lifting the voices of these youth and these teachers, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank
and
you.
Appreciate you so much in your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.